My name is Caleb. 35 years? Up until 7 months ago, my entire world was built on a lie. A lie so deeply ingrained, so intrinsically me, that the truth almost shattered me completely. I believed my parents, Margaret and Richard, were saints. Not the halo-wearing kind, but the kind who would chew gravel before letting me go hungry. I'd witnessed it, hadn't I? The endless shifts, the sacrifices, the penny pinching. 2, sometimes 3, jobs at a time. We lived in a dump, a perpetually crumbling rental that reeked of damp and regret. Vacations? A pipe dream. Every spare dime went into keeping our heads above water. I never doubted their struggle. Never. That belief, that rock-solid truth, shaped everything I was. I became a goddamn Spartan. I knew the bitter taste of poverty, the constant gnawing fear of losing what little we had. So I saved. I scraped. I worked my ass off, driven by the primal need to escape the life that had suffocated my parents. By 28, I'd finally done it. Saved enough for a down payment on a small, unremarkable house. It wasn't fancy. No granite countertops or sprawling backyard. But mine. No landlord breathing down my neck. No fearing sudden rent hikes. No packing up our lives every other year because we couldn't afford to stay. That house. It was the first thing in my life that felt truly, irrevocably secure. A tangible testament to years of sacrifice. Then the call came. 7 months ago. Mom. Her voice, usually a steady hum of practicality, was a panicked, brittle whisper. Dad! Back in and out of the hospital. Medical bills, mounting like a tidal wave. Some unexpected financial setbacks, whatever the hell that meant. They were drowning, she sobbed. They needed a significant amount of money. Fast. No hesitation. Not even a flicker of doubt. They had bled themselves dry for me my entire childhood. How could I even consider turning my back on them now? The question was rhetorical. That night, Sarah, my girlfriend, listened with a growing unease as I laid out my plan. Sell the house. The words felt like tearing a piece of myself away, but the thought of my parents suffering, it was unbearable. Caleb, are you sure? Sarah's voice was soft, laced with concern. Is there absolutely nothing else they can do? A loan? Their existing assets? Anything. My parents, of course, had already dismissed those options. Out of time. Their credit was shot. Mom had explained. Her voice choked with desperation. Time was the enemy. Selling the house was the only way to get them the money quickly enough. Sarah tried to reason with me, her eyes pleading. This is a huge decision, Caleb. Don't rush into it. But I couldn't. I was blinded by years of ingrained loyalty, the burning need to repay a debt that felt infinite. All I could see were my parents, their faces etched with worry, their backs breaking under the weight of their supposed financial ruin. A month. That's all it took. Listed the house, accepted an offer. The urgency meant I took a hit, didn't get the best price. The market wasn't ideal, but none of that mattered. I was doing the right thing. I knew it. The day I handed over the check, the cashier's check representing the lion's share of what I got from the sale of my house, my parents broke down. Mom hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, her sobs muffled against my shoulder. Dad, never one for overt displays of emotion, got choked up, his eyes glistening. I had saved them from total ruin, he rasped, his voice thick with gratitude. I moved into a cramped, depressing little rental on the wrong side of town, told myself it was temporary. I'd rebuild. I was still young, still making decent money. It wasn't ideal, but it was worth it. For them. For the first couple of months, everything felt normal. Well, as normal as possible, considering I was living in a glorified shoebox after pouring my heart and soul into a place I had to sell. My parents called constantly, showering me with thanks. Every conversation, every visit was punctuated with gratitude. They wouldn't have made it without me, they said. I was their savior. Then, the little things started. Whispers of dissonance in the symphony of their gratitude. Small, almost imperceptible cracks in the meticulously crafted facade. A new living room set. Plush, modern, expensive. I visited one weekend, and there it was, gleaming under the soft lamplight. I brushed it off. Maybe they were just letting themselves breathe after all the stress. Deserved a little comfort. A few weeks later, Mom casually mentioned they were thinking about upgrading their car. Again, I dismissed it. Maybe they were using what was left of the money to treat themselves, trying to find some semblance of normalcy after the storm. Then came the vacation. A week-long getaway to some fancy resort. Again, maybe just breathing room, but it was starting to feel like more. The real unraveling began at a family gathering. A birthday party for my cousin. My uncle, Dad's younger brother, made a throwaway comment that burrowed under my skin and festered. "It's no surprise your parents made it through," he chuckled, patting me on the back. "They've always been great at saving." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he just looked at me, a strange, almost knowing glint in his eye. "Always been careful with money," he continued, oblivious to the growing knot in my stomach. "Your dad's investments alone could carry them for years." Investments? Savings? It didn't compute. I had just bailed them out of nothing. I didn't say anything then, played it off. But the seed of doubt had been planted. It sprouted, a vine of suspicion twisting around my heart. A few days later, I stopped by my parents' house unannounced. Claimed I had left something behind on my last visit. The tension was immediate, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. I was sitting at their kitchen table, forcing a smile when I saw it. A bank statement, tucked haphazardly under a pile of mail. Open! Right there, clear as day, was their account balance. High 6 figures. My hands went clammy. The air seemed to thicken. 6 figures. They weren't broke. They weren't even close to broke. I stood up, the paper trembling in my grip. "Where did this come from?" I demanded, my voice tight. Silence. The air crackled with unspoken accusations. Mom tried to play it off. That's our retirement savings, honey. Our safety net. We didn't want to touch it unless it was absolutely necessary. Was it ever actually necessary? I pressed, my voice rising. Were you ever actually on the verge of losing your home? Did you really need my money at all? More silence. Then, a sigh from Dad. A sigh that spoke volumes. "We knew you'd help us," he said, his voice flat. "And we didn't want to risk our future when we had another option." I stared at them. These people. The people who had raised me, who I had trusted more than anyone else in the world, had let me sell my house. My security. My future. So they wouldn't have to dip into their savings? The rage, simmering just below the surface, threatened to boil over. I wanted to scream, to break things, to demand an explanation, but all I could do was stand there, numb with disbelief. I left without another word, walked out the door and into a world that had suddenly fractured. I didn't know what to do, what to think. All I knew was that I had given up everything for them, and they had never actually needed it. I had been played by my own parents. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and burning anger. Every conversation, every seemingly innocent moment, replayed in my head with a new, sinister interpretation. The late-night phone calls, Mom's tearful pleas, Dad's defeated tone. It had all been an act. A carefully orchestrated performance designed to manipulate me into doing exactly what they wanted. I sat in my crummy rental, staring at the bare walls and cheap furniture. The house I had worked so hard for, gone. And for what? So my parents wouldn't have to touch their precious nest egg? That night, I told Sarah everything. Every detail, every suspicion, every crushing realization. I laid it all out, the bank statement, their lame excuses, the fact that they had let me believe they were on the verge of homelessness when they were sitting on 6 figures. She was furious. Her face was tight, her eyes blazing. That's beyond unforgivable, Caleb, she said, her voice trembling with rage. And that was it. The dam broke. The anger bottled up for days exploded. Not just Sarah's anger, but mine. I needed to know how deep this went. How long had they been financially secure? Had they ever actually struggled the way they claimed when I was growing up? Or had this been their pattern all along? I started making phone calls. My uncle, the one who had made that offhand comment about my parents being good savers, was the first person I reached out to. I needed to know if he had suspected anything. He hesitated at first, then admitted that something had always felt off. For years, he had found it strange how my parents acted broke while still managing to make big moves behind the scenes. Small stock investments, rental properties, trips they never mentioned. He had always suspected they were hiding something, but he never had proof. That conversation only fueled my determination. I called one of my aunts, someone I knew was close to Mom. She hemmed and hawed, reluctant to get involved. But eventually, after a lot of gentle prodding, she cracked. She admitted that my parents had started investing years ago. In stocks, rental properties, retirement accounts that had done exceptionally well. In fact, they had been financially comfortable since before I bought my house. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. They had never actually needed my money. They had just chosen to manipulate me into giving it to them so they wouldn't have to touch their own. I couldn't stop myself. I called my parents, demanded answers. They didn't even try to deny it. Dad sounded annoyed, like I was overreacting. He said they had money, but they didn't want to jeopardize their future. Mom chimed in, saying their savings were for retirement, and they had to be smart about it. Were you ever in danger of losing your home? I asked, my voice trembling with rage. Silence. Then Dad muttered something about future financial security and making responsible choices. I lost it. I told them exactly what they had done. I had sold my home, uprooted my life, thinking I was saving them from ruin, when in reality, they had been just fine. And now, thanks to them, I couldn't even afford to buy another home in the same area because the housing market had skyrocketed. They didn't apologize. They didn't even seem sorry. Instead, Mom said I should be happy that I was able to help them. I should be grateful they were in a good financial position now. Dad added that they deserved to be comfortable in their later years. I need space, I said, my voice shaking. I won't be visiting for a while. Mom sounded offended. Dad just scoffed and said I was being dramatic. I hung up and blocked their numbers. A few days later, my uncle reached out. He said he had heard about the argument. He told me I wasn't crazy. He had always thought my parents were weird about money, but even he hadn't expected something this bad. He told me to stay strong and not let them manipulate me into thinking I was in the wrong. But the damage was done. The house I had worked so hard for, gone. The money I had earned, wasted. And the worst part, the people I had trusted the most had been lying to me my entire life. I was so overwhelmed, so consumed by betrayal, that I did something I never thought I'd do. I posted about it online. I didn't even think. I just sat down, typed everything out, and hit post. Maybe I was looking for validation. Maybe I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. Within hours, the post exploded. Hundreds, then thousands of people commented. Most of them were just as shocked as I was. Some shared similar experiences. Others called my parents manipulative, selfish, entitled. A few even suggested I take legal action. Not that I had much to sue them for. One comment stood out. They didn't just steal your money. They stole your future. The more I thought about it, the more I realized they were right. I had given up everything for them, and they had never needed it. It didn't take long for my parents to find out about the Reddit post. The call came early the next morning. Mom's number flashing on my screen, followed by a flood of texts. I didn't answer. Then Dad's number. Then both of them again. I ignored every single one. Less than an hour later, they left a voicemail. Mom's voice was shrill, demanding to know why I had aired our private family matters online. Dad's voice followed, low and angry, calling it embarrassing and saying I had humiliated them. Not a single word about what they had done. No apology. No acknowledgement that they had lied to me, taken my money under false pretenses, or manipulated me into giving up my home. Just pure outrage that people knew about it. I deleted the voicemail. By the end of the day, my parents' damage control was in full swing. Family members started reaching out. Some cautiously, others outright taking sides. My aunt, the one who had admitted my parents had been financially stable for years, sent a short message. "Are you okay? This is a mess." My uncle, the one who had warned me before, called to say that my parents were furious. They were telling everyone I had twisted the story, made them look like villains, and that they had needed my help but had been too proud to say the full truth. I didn't even need to respond. My cousin dropped another bombshell. My parents weren't just sitting on money. They had a financial cushion they had carefully built over the years. He had found proof that they had been quietly growing their wealth, prioritizing their security over honesty. The details were insane. Private vacations, not just the one I had noticed, but multiple over the years. They had traveled overseas, stayed in expensive resorts, and even taken cruises. A second property, a small condo in another state that they had never mentioned. Secret investments, stocks, funds, and assets I had never known about. Built over the years while I thought they were scraping by, I stared at the screenshots for what felt like hours. Had my entire childhood been a lie? All those times they had said they couldn't afford a vacation, or that we had to move because the rent was too high. Had they just chosen to live frugally while hoarding money? I didn't even know where to begin processing that. Then came another rumor, one that I couldn't ignore. A relative on Dad's side let something slip in a family group chat. Well, they used to have that offshore account, so I don't know why they'd need help. An offshore account? I didn't respond, but my cousin did. He pressed them on it, asking if my parents had money stashed away somewhere. The relative backpedaled fast, saying they didn't know for sure, and that it was just something they had heard. But the damage was done. At this point, I wasn't even surprised anymore. If they had lied about everything else, what was stopping them from hiding even more? My parents must have realized they were losing control of the narrative because, suddenly, they stopped attacking me and started playing the victims. They told everyone I was being cruel and ungrateful, that I was throwing them away after everything they had done for me, that I was selfish. I had to laugh at that one. Selfish? The same people who let me sell my house while they sat on a fortune were calling me selfish? Just when I thought I couldn't be blindsided again, I got a call from a lawyer. At first, I assumed my parents were trying to pull some legal stunt, but when I picked up, the lawyer introduced himself and told me he was handling the estate of my great-uncle, someone I had barely known. Apparently, he had passed a few months back, and since he had no children of his own, he had left a portion of his assets to me. It wasn't just a small inheritance. It was enough for a down payment on another house. I sat there, stunned. One door closed, another opened. My parents must have caught wind of it immediately because within an hour, Mom was calling me again. This time, the tone was completely different. She wasn't angry anymore. She was sweet, acting like nothing had ever happened, saying she missed me and wanted to talk things out. Dad sent a separate text saying we should sit down and work through this like a family. I didn't respond. The next day, Mom sent another message. Not even trying to be subtle anymore. She said that since I was coming into extra money, it would be a great opportunity to fix things between us. They wanted a cut of the inheritance. I finally responded with a simple, "My finances are none of your business." Then came the guilt tripping. Family should share. That's what we do. Mom, we raised you. You wouldn't have anything without us. Dad, after everything we've been through, don't you think we deserve some security in our old age? Mom, that was the last straw. I told them I was done. I wasn't sharing a cent with them, and if they kept harassing me, I'd change my number. They tried calling again. I ignored it. Then they tried one last trick, calling Sarah. She picked up, let them talk for about 30 seconds, then told them they had 5 seconds to stop contacting us before she blocked their numbers too. They got the message. I blocked them that night. The next morning, I sat down with a lawyer of my own to make sure my parents couldn't try any legal nonsense to get a share of the inheritance. With that settled, I started looking at houses again. This time, I was buying one for me. Not for them. Not for anyone else. Just for me. After I shut down my parents' attempt to guilt-trip me into sharing my inheritance, the calls stopped. No more texts, no more voicemails, nothing. They went completely silent. At first, I thought they had finally given up. Maybe they had accepted that they couldn't manipulate me anymore. But I should have known better. The silence didn't mean they were done. It just meant they were regrouping. A few days later, I started hearing from extended family. Some of them were supportive, telling me I had every right to cut my parents off. Others, though, started parroting my parents' words. Family should come before money. Don't you think you're being a little harsh? They're your parents. You owe them at least a conversation. I didn't bother explaining myself. I knew exactly where these opinions were coming from. My parents were playing the victim again. Then, Mom went public. I woke up to multiple messages from people asking if I had seen her latest Facebook post. There it was. A long, passive-aggressive status about the pain of raising a child who forgets, who took care of them, and how money changes people. No names were mentioned, but the comments were flooded with sympathy from her friends and relatives. People talking about how some kids don't appreciate their parents anymore, and how family should always stick together. I didn't respond. I didn't comment. I just watched as my own mother turned me into a villain for refusing to keep funding her lifestyle. Sarah saw it too. She was furious. She sat with me as we drafted responses to family members who were misled by my parents' lies, helping me set boundaries for good. She told me straight up that I needed to stop letting them take up space in my life. She was right. But before I could even process all of that, another relative came forward with even more information. One of my aunts, who had been quiet through all of this, sent me a private message. She hadn't wanted to get involved, but she had seen what my mother was doing and thought I should know the full truth. My parents weren't just sitting on savings. They weren't just hoarding wealth while pretending to struggle. They owned 2 rental properties. Both of them were fully paid off and bringing in passive income. I had given them everything I had to save them, while they sat back collecting rent checks every month. I didn't even hesitate this time. I called them. They picked up immediately, like they had been waiting for me. Mom started off by acting relieved, saying she was glad I was finally reaching out. Then I asked about the rental properties. Silence. Then Dad sighed and admitted it. Said they had bought them years ago as a backup plan for retirement. I asked him why. Why they had let me sell my house for them when they had never been in financial danger. His response? Because we knew you'd do it for us. That was it. No apology. No shame. Just a simple fact. They knew I would help, so they let me ruin my own future for their convenience. I don't even know what I said next. All I know is that I was done. I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I was done. No more talking. No more visits. They were dead to me, financially and emotionally. Dad tried to backtrack, but I hung up. A few hours later, he called again. This time, his tone was different, calmer. He told me we didn't have to end things like this. He said they were willing to work something out. I didn't respond. The next day, I got another call. This time, from a cousin. Apparently, my parents were now telling people that I had abandoned them and that they were barely scraping by. They had gone from bragging about their money to suddenly being broke again, the second I cut them off. It was pathetic. That was the moment I realized something important. They didn't love me. Not really. They loved what they could take from me. They loved having someone who would bail them out whenever they wanted, no questions asked. That's all I had ever been to them, and I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. I reached out to a financial advisor just in case. I wanted to make sure they couldn't pull any legal nonsense or try to claim anything from me in the future. He assured me they had no case, but I took extra precautions anyway. Then, I did the one thing they never expected. I bought a new home, with my inheritance secured, and with my parents completely out of my financial life. I put in an offer on a house. My house! No strings attached. No debts. No manipulative family obligations. Just me. And for the first time in my life, it was completely mine. I thought cutting them off would be the end of it. No more manipulation, no more guilt trips. I had secured my finances, finalized the paperwork on my new house, and for the first time felt like I had a future that belonged only to me. But my parents weren't done. A week after I blocked their numbers, they showed up. It was late, almost 10 p.m. when the banging started. Not a knock. Banging! Heavy fists against my apartment door, rattling the frame. They weren't saying my name. They weren't asking to come in. They were demanding it. Sarah stood frozen in the hallway, staring at me. I shook my head and motioned for her to stay back. I didn't answer. The banging got louder. Then the shouting started. They needed to talk. This was important. I was making a mistake. They weren't leaving until I let them in. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting for them to wear themselves out. It took almost 10 minutes before the banging slowed. Their voices got lower. Mom's tone turned from anger to pleading. Dad stayed quiet, his presence just a shadow through the peephole. Then silence. I waited 5 minutes. 10. Then footsteps. Slow, shuffling. Something slipped under the door. Then more footsteps, retreating down the hall. I gave it a few more minutes before picking it up. A letter! It was handwritten, covering both sides of the paper. The first half was everything you'd expect. Family means everything. We love you no matter what. Let's move past this. The second half? A demand. They were struggling now. They were hurting financially. And I was in a position to help. I needed to do the right thing and give them their fair share of the inheritance. I tore it in half and threw it away. The next morning, Sarah showed me something worse. Mom had taken the drama online. She had posted a long, emotional Facebook status about ungrateful children and the pain of being abandoned by the one you sacrificed everything for. The comments were filled with sympathy. People calling me cruel, asking how I could do this to my own parents. And the worst part? She had started reaching out to my friends. A few of them messaged me, confused. Some had screenshots. Mom had been privately messaging people I was close to, telling them I was cold-hearted, that she didn't understand why I had changed, that she just wanted to talk. She was fishing for someone, anyone to take her side and pressure me into reconnecting. She found the wrong crowd. Most of my friends ignored her. A couple replied, shutting her down. One even told her to stop embarrassing herself. She deleted the Facebook post a few hours later. Then, I got a call from my uncle. I hadn't spoken to him much since everything went down, but he said my dad had reached out, asking him to talk some sense into me. We agreed to meet up. We sat at a coffee shop, and he wasted no time getting to the point. He had always known my parents were weird about money, but he didn't know the full extent of it until now. He admitted that for years, he had suspected they were wealthier than they let on. Every time there was a family emergency, someone needed financial help, funeral costs, medical bills, my parents never contributed. They always had an excuse, and yet they always seemed fine, always secure, always saving for the future. He told me something else, something I hadn't expected. When I was a kid, my parents had been in a much better financial situation than I ever knew. The secondhand clothes, the skipped vacations, the constant talk about money struggles. It had never been necessary. They had always had savings. They just chose to live frugally because they didn't want to spend their own money unless absolutely necessary. They let me grow up thinking we were barely getting by. They let me believe they were struggling. When I moved out, and when they saw an opportunity to take from me instead of dipping into their own wealth, they didn't even hesitate. By the end of the conversation, my uncle looked me in the eye and said, "You don't owe them a damn thing." That night, I got one final text from my parents. They had decided to forgive me. They were willing to move past everything. All I had to do was meet with them and make things right. I sent one sentence back, "We're done." Then I blocked their new numbers. A few days later, my mom posted another dramatic Facebook rant. This time, not even hiding that it was about me. She went on about raising a son who doesn't love you anymore, how money had poisoned our family, and how she prayed that one day he'd come back to us before it's too late. I didn't react. I didn't care, because by the end of that week, I was holding the keys to my new house. My name on the deed. My future. Mine again. I walked through the front door, took a deep breath, and smiled. I was free. I thought it was over. I had cut my parents off. I had blocked their numbers, ignored their online theatrics, and walked into my new home with a clean slate. But I should have known they weren't going to let go that easily. A few weeks after settling in, I got an email from my parents filled with demands and veiled threats. They insisted I had a moral obligation to support them. Even though they had no legal standing, the email laid out demands framed as an appeal to family duty rather than an enforceable legal case. It was clear they were trying to guilt me into compliance. They were demanding a lump sum for care and expenses, and a monthly stipend moving forward. I had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They were suing me for not giving them money. I forwarded it to my lawyer immediately. His response came within the hour. Complete nonsense. They have no legal grounds, and no judge would ever take it seriously. But that didn't mean they wouldn't try to make my life miserable. Right on cue, my mom sent a long, emotional email. It was a mess of contradictions. She couldn't believe I was doing this to them. She couldn't understand how I could be so cruel after all they had done for me. They had raised me, sacrificed for me, loved me, and now I was leaving them to suffer. Then, halfway through it, it switched to shame. They were so ashamed of me. They had to tell people their son had abandoned them. They had never been so disappointed. I scrolled past it without responding. Then, my dad emailed me separately. His was short, cold, no emotion. Just a single line, "You'll regret this one day." No begging. No fake guilt trip. Just pure bitterness that I had finally refused to be used. It didn't stop there. The extended family split into two groups. Some relatives called me, trying to reason with me, telling me that I should just make peace, and that family is family. Others were firmly on my side, telling me to stay strong and not let them manipulate me again. Then my uncle called with one last bombshell. He had seen their will. They had cut me out years ago, while I had been giving up everything for them, while I had sold my house, drained my savings, and uprooted my life. They had already decided I wasn't getting a cent of their estate. The money, the investments, the properties, all of it was going to someone else. I laughed out loud. That was the final confirmation. They had never been struggling. They had never cared. They had just seen me as an easy target. I called my lawyer again. He advised me to send a cease and desist letter to officially stop their harassment. If they kept pushing, we'd escalate it legally. I posted a final update on Reddit, just to get it all out of my system. The post blew up instantly. Thousands of people flooded in, validating everything I had gone through, calling out my parents for their entitlement and greed. But my mother wasn't done yet. One last email landed in my inbox. This one was short. "Family is forever. One day, when we're gone, you'll regret all of this." I didn't even open the rest. I deleted it, blocked her email, blocked every single account they had. For the first time in my life, I was free. No more obligations. No more guilt. No more pretending they loved me when all they had ever loved was what I could give them. As I unpacked the last box in my new home, a home I bought with my money, on my terms, I took a deep breath. I had lost my parents, but I had gained something far more valuable. Freedom! Weeks went by without a word from my parents. No calls, no emails, no social media drama. It was almost unsettling. Then, just as I was starting to believe they had finally given up, the email came in. The subject line, "Let's fix this." It was from my mom. The message was long, dripping with flowery language about forgiveness, family, and second chances. She missed me. She had been thinking about me. She hoped we could talk, maybe find a way back to each other. But something was off. Nowhere in the email did she actually apologize for what they had done. Not once did she mention the lies, the manipulation, the lawsuit threats, or the money they demanded. Instead, there were subtle jabs about how I had overreacted, how I had misinterpreted things, and how they had only ever wanted what was best for me. Then, right at the end, the real reason she had reached out. She casually mentioned that they were struggling to keep up with expenses and could really use a little help since I had been so blessed financially. I laughed out loud. The entire email had been a setup, a manipulative, passive-aggressive attempt to pretend they wanted to mend things when all they really wanted was another payout. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked their email addresses and moved on. But they weren't done yet. A few days later, I got a surprise call from one of my cousins. He asked if I knew that my parents were telling people that I had stolen from them. Apparently, they had been spreading a story that they had loaned me money years ago, and now I was refusing to pay it back. Total nonsense. I had never borrowed a single cent from them. If anything, I had been the one handing them money for years. But the worst part? They weren't just saying this to family. They were telling everyone. Neighbors, old family friends, people at their church, anyone who would listen. I started digging, and sure enough, the lies were everywhere. They were painting themselves as the victims. Poor, abandoned parents who had only ever tried to help their ungrateful son, only for him to turn his back on them and rob them blind. I posted another update online, not to defend myself, but just to vent. People were furious on my behalf. Some even offered to help track down proof that my parents were lying. That's when something unexpected happened. An old family friend reached out to me, someone who had known my parents for decades. She told me she had seen my mother's Facebook posts and knew something wasn't adding up. She confirmed that my parents had always been like this. Manipulative, controlling, greedy. She told me I was right to cut them off. That tiny bit of validation. It was all I needed. But the fallout wasn't over yet. More and more people started calling them out on their lies. Their carefully crafted victim narrative started falling apart. The sympathy they had been fishing for dried up. Then, the final message from my dad. Short. Bitter. Straight to the point, you'll regret turning your back on your family. Don't come crying to us when you fail. No warmth. No emotion. Just pure resentment. For a brief second, I hesitated. Wondered if I was being too harsh. But Sarah shut that down fast. She reminded me of everything they had done. The lies. The manipulation. The fact that they let me sell my house while sitting on multiple properties and investments. This wasn't just a bad argument. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was who they were. And I wasn't playing their game anymore. That was the last message I ever read from them. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that they were planning to move to another state. Apparently, they needed a fresh start. Translation, they had burned too many bridges here. I took it as confirmation that they were finally out of options. They had tried everything. Guilt, threats, public shame, legal action, and none of it had worked. I wasn't their ATM anymore. I wasn't their backup plan. I was free. For the first time in my life, I could wake up without a weight on my shoulders. No more drama. No more fear. Just peace. A year. That's how long it's been since I cut my parents out of my life completely. No calls, no texts, no surprise visits, no sudden financial emergencies. Just peace. Looking back, I almost don't recognize the person I was back then. The son who would have given up everything just to keep them afloat. Now, they don't exist to me. And honestly, life has never been better. I settled into my new home months ago, fully paid for with my own money, no strings attached. The first night I slept there, I woke up expecting that familiar weight on my chest. The anxiety, the stress, the feeling that I was one call away from another crisis. But it never came. For the first time in my life, I was free. Sarah and I have built a life here. A real home. One that isn't tied to manipulation, guilt, or financial drain. Every time I look around, I know this is mine. If there was ever proof that cutting off toxicity leads to success, this past year was it. My career is thriving. 2 promotions in a year. More opportunities than ever. Turns out when you're not being emotionally blackmailed into giving away your hard-earned money, you can actually focus on your own life. With financial stability came real security. No more feeling like my future was at risk because my parents couldn't handle their own money. And the best part? I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. I thought they were finally out of my life for good. But a few weeks ago, a message popped up from an unknown number. It was my mother. The usual tactics were all there. Guilt, fake warmth, carefully chosen words. She missed me. She had been thinking about me. She hoped we could talk, maybe find a way back to each other. I deleted it. Didn't respond. Didn't even hesitate. I didn't owe her anything. I wasn't about to reach out to them. But I was curious. I asked a cousin what had happened to them since they moved out of state. Apparently, they had to downgrade their home. The lavish lifestyle gone. The rental properties sold off. The comfortable life they once bragged about slipping away. They couldn't keep up with their old spending habits, and now they were struggling. Turns out, when you burn every bridge and spend money like it'll never run out, reality catches up fast. The family that once defended them had finally seen the truth. Even the relatives who originally told me to forgive and forget had started distancing themselves. People caught onto their pattern. How they always had a new crisis. How they expected everyone else to bail them out. They weren't victims. They were users, and now they had no one left to use. Not everyone in the family has let it go. A few still try to guilt me into reconnecting. They're still your parents. They made mistakes, but they're struggling now. Maybe it's time to be the bigger person. I ignore every single one. They had years to fix this. Years to show real love, real change. They never did. Therapy helped me realize something I had never wanted to admit before. My parents never loved me unconditionally. They loved what I could do for them. I wasn't their son. I was their backup plan. Every sacrifice they claimed to make for me as a kid, that wasn't selflessness. It was investment. And when it was time to cash out, they expected me to hand everything over without question. Cutting them off wasn't just about money. It was about refusing to be used. Growing up, I thought having money meant being secure. But my parents hoarded wealth, and they were never truly happy. They never enjoyed what they had because they were obsessed with having more. Now, I understand that real security isn't just about money. It's about freedom. The ability to wake up every day and know no one is waiting to take from you. Not from my parents. That will never come. But from one of my aunts, the same one who originally took their side. She admitted she had been wrong. That she had believed their lies at first. But after seeing how they treated me, how they used me, she understood why I walked away. I accepted the apology, but I made one thing clear. I wasn't going back. For the first time, I get to decide who my family is. No more obligations. No more forced guilt. Just real connections with people who actually care. Instead of toxic family gatherings, I spend holidays with friends, my girlfriend, people who love and respect me. Instead of feeling obligated to give, I can give freely to the people who deserve it. The last thing I heard, they're trying to contact distant relatives for money. They burned their bridges, used up their favors, ran out of sympathy. Now they're scrambling. And the irony? The one person who could have helped them, the son they betrayed, is the only one who never will. I don't need their love. I don't need their validation. I don't need them. And for the first time in my life, I'm completely okay with that. It had been over a year since I cut my parents out of my life. No calls, no emails, no manipulation, just peace. Then, out of nowhere, a message popped up from an old family friend. They weren't reaching out to guilt me or to pressure me into reconnecting. They just thought I'd want to know. My parents were selling everything and leaving the country. It wasn't a fresh start. It wasn't some grand retirement plan. They were drowning in debt. For years, they had hoarded money, acted like they were financially untouchable, and manipulated me into thinking they were in control. But behind the scenes, they had been making terrible investment choices. Turns out, their safety net wasn't liquid savings. It was risky stocks, bad property flips, and over-leveraged assets. They had been riding a wave of good fortune for years, but the market turned on them. Everything started crumbling. The rental properties sold at a loss. The house they downgraded to gone. The overseas investments they bragged about wiped out. They weren't the rich masterminds they had always pretended to be. They were just paranoid hoarders who played a game they weren't smart enough to win. A few days after hearing the news, an email landed in my inbox. A group email. It was from both of them. The subject line, moving on. It was filled with dramatic lines about letting go of toxic family members, meaning me, how they were starting fresh in a new country, and how they were choosing to move forward without negativity. It was supposed to be some kind of power move, but it just read like one last desperate attempt at control. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for the usual emotions to hit. Anger, sadness, regret, nothing. Just indifference. I didn't care. Not even a little. I deleted the email without responding. I posted one last update online, just to get it all out of my system. Reddit exploded. People couldn't believe the irony. They had manipulated their own son for money, hoarded wealth for years, only to lose everything in the end. Some called it karma. Others said it was the most fitting ending possible. A few pointed out something I hadn't even considered. If they had just been honest with me from the beginning, they wouldn't have needed to run. But they weren't capable of honesty. They only knew greed. A week later, one final message arrived. This time, it was just from my dad. One day, you'll regret not being part of our lives. No plea for help. No fake warmth. Just one final attempt to make me feel guilty. I didn't respond. I didn't even hesitate. I blocked their new overseas number and moved on. Some relatives were shocked by how quickly their empire crumbled. Others not surprised at all. The same people who once told me to forgive and forget were now saying my parents had gotten exactly what they deserved. I didn't waste time on "I told you so." They weren't my problem anymore. With my parents completely out of my life, I thrived. No guilt. No stress, no one waiting to take from me. My career still booming. My home finally mine with no weight attached to it. My relationships stronger than ever. I thought back to the moment I sold my house to save them. The moment I gave up everything, thinking I was protecting my family. And now I realized the only person I ever needed to save was myself. The best part? I proposed to Sarah. She said yes. For the first time, I was building a future with a family that actually loved me. Her parents welcomed me with open arms, gave me the love and support that my own parents never did. I finally understood what real family felt like. They were gone. Out of the country. Out of my life. Out of my mind. I didn't just regain my financial security by cutting them off. I regained my happiness. and that was worth more than any inheritance. I went through my phone, deleted the last traces of them. No more emails, no more numbers, no more connections. Then I took a deep breath and stepped fully into my future. Free, independent, and finally, at peace. The wedding was small, intimate, just close friends and Sarah's family. Sunshine streamed through the windows of the small chapel, illuminating Sarah as she walked down the aisle. In that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. I had chosen love, chosen happiness, chosen myself. After the ceremony, during the reception, my uncle, Dad's brother, pulled me aside. He looked older, somehow more weary. "I'm proud of you, Caleb," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did what you had to do." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. I heard about Richard and Margaret. The first nodded, bracing myself for the inevitable guilt trip. "They made their choices, Caleb, and they have to live with them." He squeezed my shoulder. "Don't let their mess stain your happiness. Today is about you and Sarah." That night, as Sarah and I drove off towards our honeymoon, I glanced back at the twinkling lights of the reception venue. A wave of unexpected emotion washed over me. Not sadness, not anger, but something akin to forgiveness. Not for what they had done. I would never condone their lies, their manipulation, their selfishness, but forgiveness for the broken people they had become, for the void inside them that drove them to hoard and control. It wasn't a complete forgiveness. It was more like acknowledgement, a release of the bitterness that had poisoned so much of my life. They were gone. Their choices had led them down a different path, a path I couldn't and wouldn't follow. Letting go of the anger didn't erase the past, it freed me from it. I knew I would never forget what they had done. The scar would always be there, but it wouldn't define me. As we drove further into the night, with Sarah's hand intertwined with mine, I realized I was no longer looking back. The past was behind me. I was focused on the road ahead, on building a future filled with love, honesty, and genuine connection. And that, I knew, was the greatest revenge of all. To live a life they couldn't comprehend, a life filled with the very things they had sacrificed on the altar of greed. A life of true happiness, earned and deserved. A life finally, irrevocably, my own.